Now everybody knows that a crow arm balance is easier to hold than a headstand, and a headstand is easier to hold than a two-arm handstand, and a two-arm handstand is easier to hold than a one-arm handstand. But the more we can understand why each one of them is easier than the next will help you in your journey towards arm balances, handstands, and other calisthenics skills. So today I'm going to break down different arm balances and handstand variations, look at the base of support, the height, and then the balance window that is needed. But first of all, we need to understand what we mean by base of support and the balance window. So if we look at any position or balance, I have a certain amount of movement that I can make before I fall out of position. So I can go this way, I can go towards overbalance. I have a point if I go too far, I fall. I have exactly the same when I come to underbalance. How far can I lean backwards before I fall in this direction? Now I can move in any direction, but when it comes to most two-arm balances, you're only really thinking about overbalance and underbalance because you don't normally fall out to the side. When it comes to one-arm balances, we can fall in any direction around a 360-degree circle of the base. But let's first just look at that overbalance and underbalance. So if I'm in a handstand, I can fall back towards my feet. I have a certain distance I can go this way towards underbalance before I fall. I have exactly the same in my overbalance. How far can I go this way before I fall? So the stronger your handstand balance, the longer you can hold in a handstand, the bigger your balance window is. Exactly the same in a crow or frog arm balance position. I can go a certain distance this way towards overbalance before I fall onto my head, and I have a certain distance I can go back towards my toes before I fall back towards that underbalance. So I've been training handstands every day for 11 years now, so my window of balance is probably this big, but the beginner who's only had a week handstand in probably find that their balance window is this big. So if they fall outside those red lines, they're going to fall over. So that's going to make sense why the beginner can't kick up to a freestanding handstand, but the person like me that's been doing it for a while can kick up into a horrible position and still catch. And I can go into funky positions and not fall down because my balance window is so big. And then we can look at the base of support. So how big is the base that we have? So a handstand is going to look something like this. So your distance you have, or your area that you can balance with, that's on the floor, the base is that big. But if I look at a forearm balance where my elbows are in this position, my base of support is now double the size, it's this big. So normally when our base of support increases, the balance is going to be easier. If we go to the extreme and do a one-arm handstand, now my base of support is smaller again than both the forearm stand and the two-arm handstand, it's only this big. But then if we look at something like the handstand and the crow or the frog position, our base of support is exactly the same for the handstand as it is for the crow or the frog position. So what's in contact with the floor, the base, my hand is exactly the same in this position as it is in this position in the handstand. But this handstand position is way harder to hold than this position. So the big difference is the height. So we need to add in that third factor, which is the height. Now it's worth mentioning there's other things that will make things harder as well. So if we go into like a planche position, a press handstand position, a handstand push up, the height could be decreasing back towards that crow position, but this position is probably harder to hold than your standard high, tall handstand position, but it's harder because we now have parts of the structure that's sticking out in front or and behind the base of support. But you could argue there the intensity, so the difficulty or the strength demand is the thing that really makes it harder, not necessarily the balance aspect. So today I want to focus more on the balance, but do bear that in mind that certain positions that also require some balance will be different again. Let's now look at the difference between the handstand, the forearm stand, the crow, the frog, the headstand and the elbow lever when it comes to base support, height and the balance window needed, so the size of the balance needed to hold a comfortable controlled position. So when it comes to the standard two-arm handstand, we're going to have a medium base of support and a small base of support if we go to one arm. And in terms of a straight handstand, the height is maximum because that's our tallest position. So if we compare the handstand position, so that's the maximum height with the medium base of support, to the forearm position. So let's come down into a forearm if the cap doesn't get in the way. So here, now I've got double the base of support, so it's much easier to hold. My height is medium because I'm still in a tall position, but I've lowered down compared to that handstand position. So we have a large base of support for that forearm stand and a medium height. Now we spoke about the difference in the handstand position between the two arm and the one arm, but the other thing that we need to think about when it comes to all of these movements is the variability person to person in terms of where you put your base. So when it comes to the handstand, if I'm someone that puts their hands very close together, so like this has a much smaller base of support than if I go here. So if we look at the surface area, because remember we draw a line around the hands, we now have this surface area compared to the hands being like this and it being like that. So I've doubled the surface area by taking the hands wider. And then the other thing that will change, the height will change person to person. So if you're a taller person, your height is going to be longer, but exactly the same with weight. Calisthenics is all about lifting your body weight, balancing your body type, and that's just something we have to work with. It's not normally something we can change. Obviously weights can go up and down, but heights aren't going to change that much. Exactly the same now with the forearm stand, but you tend to get different techniques. So you'll get some people in their forearm position as they'll be like this. Now this is going to be a very different surface area to this. And even if I'm in this position, so if I'm like that, I've learnt my lesson, I'll turn the hat round, someone might be balancing back on their elbows more, not have hardly any weight in their hands, which basically means they're not using that big base of support. If I move everything this way a little bit, so now I've got more weight in the hands, it's much more comfortable to hold and I'm using more base support. But if I'm someone that has my hands like this or like this, my base support is disappearing. So even though it's a forearm stand, the surface area will change dramatically, exactly the same as it did when we changed the hand width and position. You could go into something like this, that is half a handstand, half a forearm stand, and now I have this big triangle to balance with, where if you can find the center of that, this is actually very easy to hold. So there's going to be lots of variability even in each of the arm balances. Now there's a reason why I wanted to put both crow and frog in this list separately, because if we're working towards something like a crow to handstand, then the difference between these two positions is quite dramatic on how hard that exercise is. But if we rate them on here, the base support is exactly the same as the handstand, so it's medium. Unless we have toe assist, then it would go to large. The height is small, but there's a subtle change that makes a big difference between the crow, which is normally seen as the knees on the elbows, and the frog position. See what happens when I went into the frog position, my hips sank down much lower. So crow position, higher hip, more of a stacked position. Frog position, more squished, like a squished crow, which has more the shoulders and the hips in line. So even though the base support is the same for both of them, that hip position is going to make a big difference if we're going to go up to handstand. So the frog position is easier to seesaw. So the seesaw means that I take the shoulders down, the hips up if I want to go to handstand, but the crow position is already higher with the hip, so I don't have as far to go. So those might be things you need to think about if you're working towards handstand push-ups and other skills like that, like press handstand. Then we have the headstand. Now the headstand makes a triangle, which is a very stable shape, especially if I put weight into all three corners. So I can go into this position, push up there. So notice my body's leaning back slightly. So when I lean back towards the underbalance slightly, it's going to position the center of mass more in the middle of the base support. A bit like the forearm stand, if I take the center of mass forwards or backwards, it's going to change the weight distribution of where I feel it in the base support. So if I bring it backwards, I'm going to feel it more in the hands. So if I want to go from a headstand position up to handstand, if I transfer weight back into the hands, it's much easier to go up. But if I transfer weight forwards into the head, now I can't push up from there. So again, that's very, very useful to know depending on what skill we're working towards. So the headstand is going to be a large base of support because we've got that triangle. There's 3 points of contact, very different than the medium with the 2 points of contact for the frog, the crow and the handstand. The height is like the forearm stand, it's more of a medium compared to the handstand. And then next, let's look at the elbow lever position. Now the reason I put the elbow lever in is because it's the flattest position. Now in yoga, you might call this more of a peacock position. So this type of thing where I'm resting on the elbows, I have a small-ish base of support, similar to the handstand. You will find most people will turn the hands out differently to the handstand, either all the way backwards in like a peacock, or fingers out to the side, a bit more like a planche position. We could take the base support even shorter and go to more like a croc or a single arm balance, so like that, which again has the smaller base of support, but a much easier position than a one-arm handstand. In fact, it's probably the easiest single arm balance you can learn. So for the elbow lever, we have a medium, so exactly the same as the handstand on the 2 arm. Small if we go to 1 arm. So again, exactly the same as the handstand. Height, very small, the lowest position. The only thing maybe lower would be a bent arm planche would be slightly lower because you're not actually leaning on the elbows as that shelf position. Then if we look at the size of the balance window needed to hold each of the positions, so the handstand is going to be large, especially for a 1 arm handstand, it's going to be massive. Not necessarily from a distance, but in terms of that 360 degrees. But definitely for that handstand, we want a big balance window because we're so tall in the position, especially compared to the base of support being medium or small. With the forearm stand and the headstand, we're going to be medium, as that base support definitely makes things much easier. The crow and the frog are going to be the two easier variations and only require a small balance window. But if you are working to those other skills like crow to handstand, or things like single leg crow positions, then things will be a little bit different. Now if we look at the elbow lever position, now that's relatively small, but I'm going to put medium because it's definitely harder because of how much the body sticks out compared to the crow and the frog. And then a medium plus if we're going to go towards something like the one arm version. Because again, we're not going to that forward and backwards, we're going at 360 degrees around that hand. Now all of this should make sense, but it's definitely something you should think about. And remember, we're only talking about static positions. If you take something like a crow to handstand, handstand push up, a press handstand, or something where you're dynamically moving, all of these things are going to change on the fly. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you're after coaching, check out my app, link is down in the description. Online coaching via the website, www.paultwyman.com.au, and I'll speak to you in the next one.